Chapter 1. Porterhatch Blues. The great red building in the shape of a barrel had grown dark in the rain, the natural tan of its bricks staining with the water. The rain had washed its steamed-up windows, fallen through its drain-pipes, and flowed along its gutterings all night. Now it was morning, but the sky was still full with storm clouds. The building was made of old mud, baked hard in modern kilns, bonded brick to brick at an atomic level. Each brick had been blessed by the high priest of knowledge of the Tashwari regime. Satellite feeds and aerials and data terminals had been knocked through the brick by Tashwari workers, swinging from girders around the block by their hands and tails. The bricks had been painted with a rain-tight solution. Doors and arches with electronic keys and entry systems had been driven into the barrel. A vast staircase lowered through the roof as a slab and unfurled like a card shuffle, and a big, friendly fusion boiler tunnelled into the ground underneath. The future Garland College Hall of Residence of St. Oscar's University was completed and blessed in under 10 days of the planet Della. It was not named at that point. The Sultan of the Tashwari had put on a pair of stout boots and stamped about the site, his advisers at his side quoting from an old book he carried. He pointed at and named all the 9 colleges and the university itself after things which would bring the children of Earth to his world. Then he closed the book, took the mud of construction in both hands, and held it to the sky in hope. Then he had tea. The children of Earth had been a problem for the Sultan. His world sat too close to their territory. Every year, a nearby world would align itself to, or be annexed by, the Earth's empire. The Sultan knew Earth was ruled by an elected president, but he had heard the term empire used so casually by human explorers that he became wary. A people that were fundamentally at odds as to the nature of that which ruled them, you could not turn your side to them and reach for tea. And with the ships of the human space fleet came their corporations, settling onto worlds like swarms of feeding creatures, sucking away the goodness and seeing the people of those worlds as something glimpsed from a speeding sailpod. Even if Della had been a united world, it could not have fought the humans off. But it was not. As was the Tashwari regime, there were 2 other large power blocks, the Monarchy of Gol and the Cylon Federation. These 3 nations alone included 7 separate intelligent species of vastly differing biological types. There were, including all the cults and splinter groups, over 500 officially registered religions on the planet. To unite all that would be beyond even the Sultan's charm. So, the Sultan did something very clever. He swiftly established trade links with several of the major human corporations, sending learned advisers to them. Tashwari who had spent all their time learning about the humans from their communications. These ambassadors acted as if relations with Earth were already at an advanced stage, as if genuinely mutual trade agreements and treaties were already in place. They talked about the latest share prices, and celebrities, and the wonderful human game called cricket, pitches for which already dotted the meadows of the Sultan's lands. Thanks to the chaos of the frontier and the human's capacity for delusion, these words soon became truths. The Earth's sphere of influence swept by Della, counting it as taken, civilized, urbane even. The galactic war, in which the humans and their allies struggled with an alien species that fundamentally disagreed with them, missed the planet completely. With the destruction of many lines of communication and the razing of many civilized worlds, Della's status as a place of relative safety was confirmed. There never was an invasion. The Sultan sacrificed an eye to his gods in thanks for that, in the process of a vigil in a cave deep under his palace. After he did so, numb from the shock, his other 2 eyes saw a vision of an establishment that would affirm and cement the peace that he had made. A university. A place where all species, including many of the humans, would come and learn under the palm of his hand. A place that could never be a target. Within days, all the major corporations were involved in sponsorship negotiations. Kreitel himself, greatest of the many entrepreneurs who had profited from the Galactic War, visited Della and, over tea, was persuaded of the R&D opportunities offered by a place where knowledge was free. Well, as free as the corporations wanted it to be. The campus of 9 colleges was built across a chain of hilly islands, a site agreed upon by the various countries and tribes of Della as being absolutely neutral and of no possible strategic worth, at the moment. The others had never fully given credit to the Sultan for his saving of the planet, and were puzzled, more than anything else, by his latest vision. St. Oscar's University had its own spaceport, at the insistence of the corporations. Della's first, a silver needle at the northern end of the islands that reached all the way up into orbit. When the final brick was placed in the base of that construction, when the first parties of academics and then students began to arrive, each time the Sultan prostrated himself before his gods, more certain that he had saved his world. And the cost was not too high, for was the university not made in the Tashwari style, blessed and baked and red? The gods extracted but one price. The needle of the spaceport made it rain much more often than it had. Hence the conditions over, and the presence of the barrel, as the humans called it, that morning of the human year 2593. Hence the woman who slept in one set of rooms there, dreaming of Earth, oblivious to the rain and the leaves of alien autumn that were splattering against her window. She was finally woken only by a bad dream. Professor Bernice Summerfield woke up, stretched, and groaned. The stretch had brought on the groan. That was nothing to do with the look of the day. She'd got used to the torrents of the Delahan autumn. The groan was to do with the crunch of muscles at the back of her neck, and the weight that had been settled in the middle of her head during sleep, which had now rolled over to smack against the inside of her forehead. Surprisingly, she hadn't been drinking last night. With her eyes tight shut, she reached out to the cabinet beside the bed and laid her fingers on her glasses. Sheer affectation, these, a product of the same urge that had lined every one of her rooms with books, and had made her order a dozen trad jazz discs from Earth, at the vast prices of ancient vinyl. Bernice was trying very hard to be old. Judging by the feeling down her spine this morning, she was succeeding. She dropped the spectacles onto her nose and opened her eyes. She was only in her mid-30s, but this last few weeks she had found herself desiring to be much, much older. To have a body that was like one of the leaves that the Spencer fields were fluttering off the window, all brown and curled, and a mind that was without desire. This age thing, and the spine thing, were both products of not having a body beside her under this double duvet, after having got used to that feeling. Her husband then was her husband no longer. At least they were no longer married. And, though she had cried and cried, and the parting had been her decision, she still regretted it every day. That was also the cause of a band of whiter flesh around her ring finger. Breaking up, Bernice discovered, was hard to do. Harder than getting one's tights on after swimming. Harder than table football. Harder than a lump of something that lay over your ribs in the night. Bernice was an archaeologist of some fame, the author of the best-selling coffee table book that everybody had bought, but nobody had read. Down Among the Dead Men. After the heartache and the separation, she'd jumped at the chance of a teaching post at St. Oscar's. St. Oscar's, following their policy of recruiting the most glamorous, if not necessarily the most learned scholars, had jumped at having her. Her head of department, Dr. Follett, an aged reptilian, who purposely didn't regulate the cloud of chlorine that surrounded him when Bernice was in his office, hadn't been so keen. But at St. Oscar's, the shilling was mightier than academic respect. Writing a similarly best-selling sequel to her book, with lots of mentions of the quality of the archaeology department at St. Oscar's, had been written into Bernice's contract of employment for taking up the Edward Watkinson Chair of Archaeology. She had a title for the new work, So Vast a Pile. But that was about it. Even at this early stage, the publishing arm of the university had started to write her nervous letters concerning the delivery of the manuscript, hinting that they might eventually get someone else to write it, want their investment back, or even one day maybe sue her. Oh well, she was sure that she'd get around to writing it one day. If the publishers got too concerned, she'd just tell them she'd had a system crash and lost the manuscript. Or something. And all this was good, because it provided something to do, some security, some people to talk to. Somewhere to stop being so bloody rooted in depression and start living again. Jason had gone, and he was, in all probability, not going to come back. Unless she asked him. And she didn't even know what part of the galaxy he was in these days, so no, it didn't matter that every time she thought of something they'd done together, she felt bruised. That she associated whole countries, genres of music, and the actual experience of watching old cinema with him, and him only. And that every time one of those things crossed her mind, her face clouded, and her students asked her what was wrong. She'd got so used to having a little bundle of thoughts that boiled down to, and Jason too, at the end of her musings. Such as, what colour should I paint my study? What would Jason like? And that was a good play. I must tell Jason about it. And these thoughts were with her this morning, as they always were, like vultures round her bed. There was absolutely no point in being depressed, she told herself as she hugged the pillow. Depression was counterproductive, and why should she give him that satisfaction? Not that it was anything to do with him any more. Not that he'd ever know. She took her first deep breath of the morning, and convinced herself that she was old and wise, and felt better. "Woolsey," she called, clicking her tongue against the roof of her mouth. That was the name of her tabby tomcat. "Where is he?" "I'm afraid I don't know, Rector." A white sphere, about the size of a billiard ball, drifted towards the bed. This was Joseph, her porter, whose presence had started to irritate Bernice a month ago. That was on the day after she had moved in. The whole business of being the rector of Garland College, in charge of the moral well-being of 1,000 young beings, was a bit of a bugger too. Bernice threw the duvet over her head. "Lullaby of Birdland," she mumbled. "As you wish." The porter floated towards an ancient vinyl record player. The arm lifted itself and dropped onto a record that sat there. The gentle tunes soothed out from the speakers, one placed on top of the wall bookshelf and one beside the collection of empty and half-empty wine bottles. "You have a tutorial at noon, Rector," said the porter, "and, of course, tomorrow is the expedition to Perfecton, for which you have not yet begun to pack." Your head of department also wishes to remind his staff about the later field trip, only he emphasizes accommodating 2 students, which nobody wants to do because it's too boring. I know, Joseph. Right now, I want tea, the campus bulletin, and love. The sphere paused. "Please, Rector." "Please what?" "Tea, the campus bulletin, and love, please." Bernice peered out from her duvet cave. "Please, Joseph, bring me all those things." "Very well, Rector." The porter floated out through the porter hatch at the top of the door. Bernice pushed off the duvet and put her feet down on the carpet, searching without looking for her newly purchased carpet slippers. If Joseph was going to bring her love, she definitely wanted to get to the bathroom before it arrived. Part 2 of an everyday waking up in the Garland College rector's rooms, the ordeal of the bathroom mirror. Before she was married and divorced, Bernice had mocked the fatty concerns of lesser women. She had known then that she was gorgeous, a certainty that sprang from an internal well of gorgeousness. Hubby had dipped his ladle into that well a few too many times, and had taken some of the gorgeousness away with him. When she married Jason, Bernice had completely cast aside the thought that she might ever want to be stared at by 18-year-old boys. Now she was surrounded by them, her students, and, as far as she could tell, they were simply not staring. She pulled a face, a big pout. Her short-cut dark hair was spiked up by the pillows. Her girlish complexion, until recently free of makeup, had a dusting of lines across the cheekbones. Under her eyes was darkness. She looked like a howler monkey. The bath was a blessed relief, as baths to Bernice always were. She had been in the field and up to her armpits in mud, often enough that the terms she had written into her contract included provision of a vast bathroom and appropriately vast bath. The porter returned after a blissful 10 minutes, carrying a steaming cup and a data screen on a silver tray. Benny caught the data screen as Joseph dropped it into her hand, wondering as she did so if a miss would have electrocuted her, leaving the porter with its non-existent hands clean of her murder. The headlines of the campus bulletin scrolled with her eyeline. They'd reduced the journey time to 11 months, and the celebrity burglar known as the Cat's Paw had been briefly thought to have been responsible for a burglary in Rigg College halls, resulting in a security operation that had only succeeded in capturing one of the dean's pet honking birds. She sighed as she inhaled the aroma of the cup of tea that levitated gently onto the bottle shelf beside the bath. "Do you think I should be getting older, Joseph? If you are not, Rector, then you are unique." Bernice settled back into the bath, wedging the data screen between her toes and sucking the surface off the tea without using her hands. "I'm just trying to age gracefully. As a full professor, I feel that one ought to abandon one's speeder pod and buy a proper bicycle. Most newly separated women would, I fancy, begin a desperate scramble to regain their youth. I am different. I am thoughtful. I have decided to get old instead." "Very clever, Rector. I wonder if I should have a breast enlargement." The porter gave a little mechanical whine, its internal gears trying to formulate a response. Bernice looked up before it could. "Any sign of Wolsey yet?" "No, Rector." "That's so strange. He's normally here for his bickies, 8 on the dot. I hope he hasn't got into a fight." Bernice sloshed a bit, picked up the tea, drank deeply of it, and managed her first smile of the day. "Why are you still hovering there, Joseph?" "I was waiting for a moment to interject. The remainder of your request is waiting. You mean love, don't you?" Benny slowly lowered the teacup. "The young gentleman is in the study." Bernice screamed. 10 minutes later, very fully dressed, Bernice cautiously poked her head around her study door. An incredibly well-dressed, thin boy with a flop of brown hair over his eyes was standing in the corner, idly toying with the globe of Della that Bernice had placed atop the fridge. It was Doran. Joseph, with its obscene sense of humour, had brought her Doran. The boy was in her tutorial group, an absurdly waif-like teenager with a vast knowledge of theoretical archaeology and a pair of extraordinary azure eyes. Every now and then he asked Bernice questions that she couldn't answer. He had even, according to the computer records that Bernice had hacked into by chance one day, read some of her articles. Goodness, this was an ugly boy. Ugly, ugly, ugly. Get somebody thrown out of St. Oscar's University. Ugly. Bernice forced her face into a frown and made a humping noise. She was pleased by the way Doran jumped. "Yes," she queried testily, marching into the room. "What do you want at this time in the morning?" She plucked a book from the shelf, as if that was what she had come to do, and found that it was her own. Bernice studied it anyway, and then, with the precision of a preemptive nuclear strike, glanced up at the student over her glasses. "Speak?" The porter asked me here. I'm... Oh, Bernice cut in, a moment into his blush. You're Michael Doran, aren't you? Yes, Professor Summerfield. Thought I recognized you. I wanted to lend you a book. Couldn't you have done that at the tutorial? What? Oh, no. Bernice randomly plucked another book from the shelf, flapping her arms to try to appear even more willfully eccentric and hide her own fluster. Too many books in the bag already, young man. I'd like you to study this in detail and tell me what you think. She pressed the book into his hand. He looked at the title page for a moment. Make Dangerous Love to Me, the erotic poetry of Carla Sampiras. Bernice bit her bottom lip. There are bits about archaeology. Oh, Doran nodded and smiled innocently. By the way, I think I saw your cat on the way over here. He was up a tree and... Oh, was he? I'd better go and rescue him. See you at the tutorial. The door slammed so loudly behind her that it made Doran jump again. Bernice whizzed down the red brick incline that marked the edge of Goodyear College on her bicycle, following the route that Doran must have taken to get to her rooms. The search for Woolsey wasn't entirely motivated by a desire to get out of a nervy situation. Bernice and her archaeology tutorial group left on an expedition to the planet Perfecton tomorrow, and if Woolsey wasn't found by then, Bernice wondered if she could still go. The archaeological treasures of a previously unexplored world were one thing, losing one's cat was another. But that fear was, as yet, still at the back of her mind. The air tasted dark and spicy this morning, fresh with the smell of wet leaves. It was good to feel the rain. Jason had always loved this time of year. He probably still did. She scattered a group of students as the bicycle careered down into a courtyard. One Utsoy boy in a suit of red feathers dropped his books, and she stopped for a moment to help him pick them up. The campus was certainly crowded for the start of the new academic year. Professors who had been here longer than Bernice told her that, in the early years, there had been very few students. It had taken the financial might of the corporate sponsors to lure academics to the place, to build centres of excellence in half a dozen different disciplines. Again, that was down to the will of the Sultan to protect his planet and its culture, inoculating his world with a small sample of the outside to save it from the plague. Secure the mind, as Bernice's just-begun monograph about the history of this place put it, and the rest will follow. Nobody had seen a cat. They probably thought she was mad for using an antique vehicle when there were underground speed pavements, flyer pads, the carrier tunnels between the islands. But Bernice's bicycle was old and sturdy, with a basket on the front, a big brass bell, and a little gravitic motor to help with the hills. It got her out into the world, made her work her calves, made her breathe a bit harder. She went on her way again. The bad dream last night had been unusual. It wasn't one of the regular ones about missing the last spaceship, dropping valuable vases over cliffs, not catching the elephant that had leapt from the other trapeze. It was about being on stage. An audience was watching her, bored and grumbling as she tried to reach out to them with a dramatic piece. She knew that what she had to say was passionate and profound, but on her lips the words had become too concrete and crude. She died on stage and started to cry, asking the watchers just what they expected of her, asking how much longer she had to go on, how much harder she was expected to try. Good to be awake out of that one. Bernice saw a familiar figure ahead of her. He was marching towards the lecture theatres in his long black coat, carrying a bundle of leads and tubes over his shoulder. His walk, as always, was that of somebody who felt that he was about to be disturbed in the midst of doing something that, even if quite innocent, he felt he ought not to be doing. He had an aesthetic, high cheekboned face, with a mop of brown hair that, because of an unfortunate double crown, could never be put into anything resembling a style. He was always freshly shaved, and always had shaving cuts. This was Menlove Stokes, Professor of Applied Art, a fellow new arrival, and somebody whom Bernice had taken an instant liking to, because he was thoroughly harmless and, more than any other sort of person, she loved the company of the harmless. He was, like her, something of an intellectual celebrity, the host of the popular weekly art transmission, Paint Along with Menlove. "Morning, Menlove," she said, slowing her bicycle to a walking pace beside him. "Have you seen a cat this morning?" "A cat?" Stokes looked as if he was being accused of stealing one. "No." "Why? Have you lost Woolsey?" "Yes, and it's starting to worry me. How awful. I'm so terribly sorry." Bernice nodded at the things hanging over Stokes' shoulder. "So, what are the tubes for? Should I ask?" "My new project." Stokes looked to his left and right, and then whispered conspiratorially to Bernice, "I intend to shove them up my every orifice." "Goodness! I don't think you should take your critics so much to heart." Stokes ignored the barb. "Pictoscopic sampling is at the cutting edge of art, an aesthetic location of which I am the natural inhabitant. The liquids which I extract from the centre of my being I shall use to fashion my paintings of the surface of Perfecton. The human fluid in alien circumstances. Bile in space. You understand?" Bernice agreed that she did, and bicycled on. There were places on the campus that one couldn't go, not without a security badge and a lot of electronic checks. The Advanced Research Department was one. It had been built as an extension of Prakatan College, but had only one entrance, a forbidding pair of jet black doors, with a security guard standing there 26 hours a day. Bernice stopped outside the doors and talked to the girl on guard. She wasn't a Gol fundamentalist, obviously, or she wouldn't have been there, but the Gol physique, particularly that of the females, was valued across Della for mercenaries and bodyguards. Behind her, a camera watched from a security panel. Bernice knew that there would be questions asked of her in the Senate for even stopping here, but the whole business of secrecy and security irritated her, particularly in a centre of learning, and she took the opportunity to tie her bootlaces and smile at the camera every time she passed. Whatever they were working on in there, it brought finance to Della from off-planet. Campus legends spoke of the whole building being kept in darkness, of alien researchers who sometimes ventured out in the early hours, and of strange noises from the ventilation ducts that the building shared with the college. Bernice had very little goal, but managed to ascertain that the guard hadn't seen any small animals since lunch yesterday. She cast a wary glance over her shoulder as she moved on, full of dark thoughts about what might happen to a cat that strayed into that place, and saw the girl talking into the security panel behind her. Hetty Bonestall and Lucinda Pargeter were St. Oscar's joint occupiers of the chair of etiquette, the result of a bureaucratic error which nobody had the courage to correct. Bernice found the two of them on the corner beside the parapsychology labs. The two old ladies were always perfectly presented, in neat little dresses and shawls, their grey hair pinned up above their hawk-like eyes, their mouths permanently curled downwards as they eyed each other. They were such clones of each other that their presence here together could only, Bernice thought, be the product of some greater plan for mischief in the universe. At this moment, they'd surrounded Professor Warrender, the head of Psi, a Pakar male. The Pakars were short and fluffy, with powerful hind limbs and little paws. They reminded Bernice of nothing more than giant hamsters, as she'd told Warrender one night over a bowl of kinsa seeds in the Collins College bar. He had laughed at the photo of the hamster Bernice had once owned, and said that had nothing to do with evolution, and everything to do with the wonderful sense of humour that the universe had, which was probably what lay behind the coincidence of the dear ladies too. Warrender was possibly the most powerful psychic that his race had ever produced. His talent was precognition, for which reason he was barracked by the physics department at every Senate meeting. "Predict this!" they'd shout at him, throwing their lunch at the pucker in an effort to prove that he couldn't possibly peep over the parapet of time. But Warrender persisted, and Bernice, who had a rather grand and poetic view of space and time, and had really loved her hamster, admired him for it. She believed in his powers completely. The first thing he'd said to her was, "Yes, I can." Bernice's reply had been, "I hear you can predict the future." The dear ladies of etiquette doubtlessly had views of their own on precognition, but both loved Warrender equally, ferociously and competitively. The three-way conversation between them currently centred on whose onboard party Warrender would attend on the way to Perfecton. A large number of academics had booked places on the archaeology trip to this particularly famous planet, and by the sound of the conversations Bernice had overheard on the subject, many of them had decided to make a cruise of it. "I shall have the ship's captain at my party," Hetty was assuring Professor Warrender. "That is entirely possible," Lucinda agreed, "if the captain can be in two places at once, since he has personally assured me—" Bernice jumped off her bicycle and made an extravagant and sudden motion with her arms in front of the three of them. Any verbal attempt to barge into one of the warring academics' battles inevitably began a joint assault on the rudeness of the interloper. "Excuse me, has anybody seen my cat?" Warrender grabbed her hand in his paws, relieved at the interruption. "Woolsey? Yes, I have seen him. In a dream last night." "Could you tell me where he is?" The two old ladies glanced at the paws clasped around Bernice's hand, at each other, and then back to Bernice, glowering. Warrender's little eyes glittered for a moment. Then he nodded. "He's in the cloisters of Pierce College." Bernice beamed, kissed Warrender on his fluffy cheek, and hopped on her bicycle again. "Thanks," she called as she cycled off. "Never shorten a thank you," Hetty bellowed after her. "Honestly, these younger academics, such a bad example. Now, Professor Warrender, as I was saying—" Bernice crossed onto the smallest island of the campus via a travel tube. She parked her bicycle in the rack at the gates of Pierce College, thankful that the rain had eased slightly. Pierce was the college that housed the mature students, home of philosophy and literature of the Milky Way. It was in a quieter part of the islands. Bernice wandered into the Pierce courtyard, glancing around at the elegantly bioengineered gardens, the trees dripping in the rain. She ran a hand through her hair, smoothing the water from it. Woolsey was nowhere in sight. There was only one person in the quad, standing by the fountains that surrounded a marble statue of a woman, her arms spread wide. The man was clad in a black academic gown, and he had his hands clasped behind his back. The courtyard was full of the sound of water, the rain, the fountains, and the rush of it around the guttering of the roofs. Bernice was about to call to the man when he turned, opened his mouth in surprise, and then smiled at her. "Ah, Professor Summerfield, I've been hoping to meet you." He stepped towards her. His voice was rich and cultured, possibly an old Earth accent. He had a face that was lined with experience, the sort of face a vicar or an aged comedian might have. His eyes were extraordinary, and they held Bernice for a moment. They were dancing with interest, as if she was suddenly the most important thing in the world to this man. "You have me at a disadvantage," said Bernice, wondering if she'd met him at one of the many induction evenings and staff get-togethers. "Professor Archduke," he said, taking her hand with a cold smile. "Earth literature. I specialize in obscure theatrical forms." "Pleased to meet you. I was just wondering—" Another cat inquiry would have followed, but then something very strange happened. From above the courtyard came the sound of a scream. A thin, high-pitched scream, increasing in volume above the noise of water. It was coming closer. Bernice, who had been in the odd bombardment in her life, was the first to look upwards. A missile was falling straight towards them, a little, darker dot against the storm clouds of the sky. It was getting bigger every second. No, not a missile, she thought, as she threw herself at Professor Archduke and crashed him into the wet gravel, shielding him with her body. It was actually a... The falling thing hit the statue and exploded into flesh. The body hit with a terrible thump, like meat thrown onto a butcher's slab. And then there was silence. Bernice and Archduke gathered themselves up, wiping bits of blue stuff off their clothing, and got to their feet. Splattered across the statue were the remains of an alien corpse. The body was humanoid, its uniformed midriff crumpled across the torso of the statue, its limbs everywhere, its head a mess in the bowl of the fountain, where the waters were already spraying blue. Bernice realized that, as she had looked up, already moving, she'd seen its eyes, its face. There had been something odd about its face, as if it was covered in string, its expression of fear. She thought that perhaps the species was familiar, but there was no way to identify it from what remained. "If that's something to do with Rag Week," she told Archduke, "then I'm resigning my post." They poked around the corpse as porters came buzzing in, their little sirens disturbing the quiet of the quad. There seemed to be nothing in the sky above, nowhere the creature could have come from. Bernice was too shocked to feel horror or squeamishness. The strange nature of the creature's arrival had rendered it not quite real, and the conversation after its arrival, without the weight of any reasonable speculation to hold it down, couldn't help but turn to other things. Bernice got the feeling from the corpse of being sacrificed to comedy, its poor life nothing more than a punchline in the wrong place. Not even funny. It reminded her again of her dream, that inability to communicate an individual drama. The porters cleared away and cleaned up, and in the end, Bernice and Archduke could only shrug at their questions. Archduke watched as they left, carrying the remains of the alien. He took a deep breath and seemed to decide on a serious course of action. He turned back to Bernice. "I wonder if you might do me a small service," he began, "in return for which I shall take you to your cat. Follow me, if you would." He crooked a finger, and Bernice, surprised, followed him to his rooms. Woolsey was eating from a soup bowl full of meat when Bernice found him, contentedly munching away in Archduke's hall. His fur was fluffed up and full of water, and he looked happy to have a place to shelter and eat. Bernice plucked him up against his struggles and glared at the tabby. "There you are. Why are you here and not at home for your bickies?" "I'm afraid that I detained him with an offer of foodstuffs," Archduke told her, hanging his cloak on a peg. "It's not often that I get a visitor. Now, concerning that favour—" "Anything," Bernice declared, "for finding Woolsey." Archduke grinned. "I have written a book of which I am rather proud, and since it concerns a theatrical form from your favourite era and planet, 20th century Earth, I was wondering—" Bernice's heart sank, but she managed a bright smile. "Oh, of course I'll read it. I'll need something to keep me occupied on the journey to Perfecton." "Ah, yes, Perfecton. I am envious of you all. My slight sway with the Vice-Chancellor was not enough to secure me a berth. I suppose that Earth literature isn't the most obvious of studies for a journey to a dead civilization. I don't think etiquette is going to be a vital discipline in the exploration either, but we have no fewer than 2 specialists in that field coming along. Knowledge above all, as they say. To take 1 etiquette specialist to Perfecton may be a misfortune. To take 2 is sheer bloody nonsense," Bernice finished. "You know the quotation." Archduke moved towards his library. "I'll just get that data module. I'm sure it's compatible with the cruiser's computer." Once he had gone, Bernice kissed Wolsey on the top of his head. "See what you've made me do?" she whispered. "You've made me read a textbook." Extract from the diary of Bernice Summerfield. After I dropped Wolsey off at my rooms, and gave him one of his looks right back at him when he realised that his Bicky ration had been cut in half, I rushed to my noon tutorial. That, as always, faded into an afternoon beer session in the Garland College bar, the Witch and Whirlwind. There's nothing like good rich ale when the shadows grow longer and the gold of autumn is on the land. It helps you to embrace time, makes you philosophical, or just too pissed to care. Over a couple of pints of it, I became settled into my favourite bar corner armchair, 7 of the most devoted of my protégés gathered in an adoring circle about me. Doran was there, but I managed to resist the urge to ruffle his hair, pinch his fresh cheek, or pat him on the head. An urge towards maturity should not immediately turn one into a fruity old lady. He'd already started to read the book I'd given him, and didn't question the lack of archaeological material so far. My 6 other admirers were Arex, Polybus, a Lucidian with golden skin who wears a freedom ring through his nose, a Lucidian power Y-shirt, and bristles at every mention I make of human achievement, insisting that the lost empire of Lucidia had been behind every major achievement in human history. He's actually right about that, but I wouldn't dream of telling him. Rose, Anne-Marie, a human girl who dotes on my every word and gesture, violently rowing with Arex whenever he disagrees with me. I think she may have a little bit of a crush on me, the poor thing. Philippe, Okjin, a vastly chested Maldine sports student who tries to translate everything into a bizarre philosophy he calls common sense and can't be bothered to work too hard. He fears change, I think. Waspo, Jane, a rich and offhand girl who spends all her time making sure that her dress doesn't get dirty. She seems to hang around me because she regards me as the closest thing the course has to a celebrity. Goddess knows what she'll be like in the field. Plus, Vitor, a bit of a lad. He keeps making Chelonian jokes which, since I have some personal experience of that species, I suppose I should complain about. He's also, unfortunately, a linecarist. You get a lot of these cultists in 20th century studies, but this one's my first. That's the trouble with religious tolerance. It stops you from giving somebody a good slap. Marjorie, a very caring and sharing young woman with pink hair and cheeks, who insists that we should forget all our differences and cooperate, and that everybody's point of view is equally valid. Whereas I tend towards the view that my point of view is rather more valid than anyone else's. Her services at the more fractious moments of debate amongst this lot are welcome. We were debating, the current vogue in archaeology for actually experiencing the times researched, via sophisticated computer recreations of the era concerned. Now, I think this is bollocks. Basically, that history creeps into the book of archaeology and rewrites every line, to the point where any reading of the past distorts it. It's a sort of quantum fridge light-on-off status look-inside thing. But then I'm vastly experienced in practical archaeology, and my young charges are but students, not yet having got their hands dirty. I held up a hand, and Rose hushed the others in expectation of my words of wisdom, her bright eyes positively staring at me from under her untended plop of blonde hair. You have not lived, I told them, until you've been up to your thighs in mud, your mind completely on the job. Really? Doran had his chin rested on his hands, gazing at me with puppy eyes. Unfortunately, said Waspo, flicking her raven-black bob away from her sharp features, it doesn't sound like the way to get rich and famous. At the end of the day, all things considered, that sounds like the last chance saloon for any title hopes, agreed Plus, grinning a grin of irregular and missing teeth before draining his pint. That's the only way we're going to understand Perfecton civilization, I said. I took another sip from my beer, and watched the first rays of afternoon sunlight peeping through the clouds outside the window. The golden fittings on the bar looked particularly nice that afternoon, and I wondered what they would look like buried in sand, unearthed by alien fingers in a few centuries. I was prey that day, as I often am, as archaeologists in general often are, to mortal thoughts. Perhaps I had some inkling of what was later to befall me, or perhaps not. The perfectons, as we call them, because they never left a name for themselves, vanished 5,000 years ago, before most currently civilized species, yes, including yours, Arex, had been into space. They had technology beyond our dreams, but didn't leave their homeworld. All we know of them is in the records left by other races who landed on Perfecton, and they're very incomplete. We don't know, for instance, why they died out. They probably had a war or created a virus or something. Philippe took another draught from his protein drink and yawned, his big face unfolding and then folding up again. He smacked his chops together a few times and laid his head on his hands, as if about to drop off. I nodded brightly, trying to encourage these small seedlings of intelligence. That's why Earth Central declared Perfecton to be a prohibited world when it was located. That order is lifted next week, and you're all utterly fortunate to be part of the first scientific landing party. Don't let the activities of our shipmates fool you. This journey is going to be about hard work, about archaeology. This is the real thing. I threw back the last dregs of my pint. We leave tomorrow, so early to bed, and remember to pack your equipment. With that, I stood up, sat down again, made a greater effort, and then stood firmly on my feet. My students gave me a round of applause. I found the door quite easily, just as two men I didn't recognize were entering the bar. One was fat and solid-looking, the other was thin and sharp. They were dressed in identical dark suits and Homburg hats, which, I confess that I only realized this a couple of hours later, weren't stained by the rain at all. They were attempting to be inconspicuous by wearing shades. Everybody in the bar looked at them. They stopped when they saw me, as if they recognized me. The fat one took a step closer, looking very serious. "We," he whispered in my ear, "are on a mission from God." "How nice for you," I said, and left. I often think that if I paid more attention, I'd lead a much more comfortable life. Diary entry ends.